Number 10. Jean Grey was resting the whole time. After Jean Grey died as part of the Phoenix Saga, everyone was left flabbergasted. During the story, we'd seen Jean merge with the Phoenix Force, become insanely powerful, lose control over this power, become corrupted and dark, basically become a huge supervillain, and finally sacrifice herself, knowing that if she didn't, it would only end badly. Or worse than badly, because it was already pretty bad. Jean Grey, one of the original X-Men team, was dead. Or so it seemed. Later on, Marvel would want to revive the original X-Men team and bring them together on a new team and comic series called X-Factor. So Jean needed to come back to life. But hey, she was dead. So we got the added story to explain that the version of Jean that had died wasn't really her, but was a separate entity known as Phoenix. Sort of this merged thing. Wasn't really Jean. Jean herself was resting comfortably in a pod beneath the ocean, still lived, and would be able to return. Yay. Number 9. Tony Stark was adopted. Yep, that's the thing that happened. I'm just wondering if this one will show up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I can't deny that if we get an Arno as a result, an Arno Stark, I would actually not be too upset with that, even though this retcon's pretty weird. The reason this retcon was such a terrible retcon for Tony was that his parents and their loss always remained a great catalyst and huge emotional plot point for him. Now, of course, just because he was adopted doesn't mean that he can't still love his parents as much as he did and still be as emotionally affected by their death. That's not what I'm saying. But his parents also had a naturally born son that they hid from Tony, who was born before they adopted Tony, and he also didn't know that he was even adopted. Also, there were aliens and alien tech involved in Arno's birth, which explains why this all had to be a secret, but also it's just a lot. All in all, this revelation greatly changed the way Tony saw his parents and made their relationship more complex. And I don't know if either of those things needed to happen. Number 8. Hail Hydra. One of the most shocking moments in Marvel's comic history was when it was revealed that Captain America was actually a sleeper agent for Hydra the whole time. Say what? The guy who for years was diametrically opposed to Hydra and all their beliefs, who had tried and succeeded to foil their plots countless times, was a Hydra agent? How could this be? Well, apparently all those wins were a part of his doing a very good job to convince us all and trust him so that he could stab us in the back at the right moment and take over America, becoming Hydra Supreme. Fortunately, this evil version of Captain America would later be revealed to have been created by Kobik, a living sentient version of the Cosmic Cube who was manipulated into making this retcon happen. What's more, the true Captain America still existed within the shards of the Cosmic Cube and would return once more to defeat his evil self, fixing the timeline. So, I mean, at least this retcon ended up not staying permanent, but still, it's pretty weird. Number 7. Professor X married Mystique. Some retcons that are really strange come from film inspiration. As a lot of people discussed in the comments, many feel that Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, for example, would still be mutants today if it wasn't for their being introduced in the MCU's Avengers franchise, which didn't have the rights to include mutants, so we had to kind of unmutant them. I feel as though the case was possibly similar for this weird, secret retcon. In 2013's Uncanny X-Men issue 24, we learned of Mystique and Charles Xavier's secret marriage, meaning that the child we saw Mystique gave birth to while in the guise of Moira McTaggart was likely one willfully conceived, as opposed to Mystique tricking Charles into sleeping with her, which would have been super weird and pretty not good in my opinion. In the X-Men prequel films such as First Class, which came out in 2011, we see a different kind of relationship between Raven and Charles. We get this weird love triangle between Charles, Raven, and Eric, and it seems more of that likely influenced this weird retcon plot point revealed in the comics, in Charles's will. Number 6. Ugly equals evil. That's what Thanos' retcon taught us. Yep. Thanos' backstory was added in detail in the series Thanos Rising, and what many fans were surprised to learn was that his mother was apparently driven mad by her newborn baby's hideous appearance, and because of his appearance, claimed that she needed to kill him. That's pretty terrible. She sensed basically that because he was ugly, he would also be supremely evil. And the really shocking part of this was, of course, that she was right. But also, what the heck? Just because you don't like the look of your baby doesn't mean it should deserve to die. Fortunately, a retcon was later added to fix this when it was changed to it not being the baby's appearance but to a specific deviant gene in the child's genetic code that concerned both of his parents instead. Still, not great, just analyzing your baby's genes and being like, we already know you're gonna be evil. But it's better than it just being about the ugliness in appearance as the pure reason for condemnation, I guess.
Number 5. Evil Amazons. Yeah, you heard that correctly. The New 52 comes through yet again to disappoint fans. The New 52 Wonder Woman series began in June 2016, and Brian Azzarello made the Amazons' origin so that they attacked sailors on the high seas that were too close to their land. Okay, and if that wasn't bad enough, Azzarello even went so far as to make the Amazons murder these sailors and then toss their bodies in the water. And if they have any sons, well, those sons are being sold right into slavery. I don't think we'll be seeing this in the Wonder Woman sequel. I mean, maybe? Imagine if they went from like the first movie to like a band of hardcore pirates just whipping people off boats. Get out of town. The Wonder Woman clay origin was preferred over the new stuff. These false memories that were written to her story were liked. I mean, rightfully so.
Number 4. Peter and MJ's marriage never happened. During the story One More Day, Peter made a pact with Mephisto to ensure that his Aunt May would live. Part of this deal was also that people would forget Peter's secret identity, which was currently out in the open. Although it wasn't like a bargain part of the deal, it was just a thing that would happen. But what did Mephisto want in return for this? Peter to never be a hero again? Did he want his soul? No. No, 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 no. He wanted his marriage? Mephisto wanted to take Peter's marriage to MJ. And by that, I don't mean that he wanted himself to marry MJ, which would actually make, in a weird turn of events, more sense. I mean, he wanted to make it so that their marriage never existed. This was such a strange request that many were left speechless when Peter agreed and this actually happened. What was likely really going on is that Marvel no longer wanted Peter to be married. Or Joe Quesada never wanted Peter to get married in the first place. They wanted to return to the days when Peter was flying free and single, so this story happened to erase it.
Number 3. Jason Todd. Ah, yes, the over-aggressive black sheep of the Bat family. The poster boy for toxic Batman fans everywhere, and the most lazily written Robin of the bunch. At least at first. When Jason Todd first showed up on the scene, after the Robin mantle was abandoned by Dick Grayson, it was downhill from the start. For starters, DC made his backstory almost identical to that of Dick himself. Jason was part of a circus that was attacked by Killer Croc, which resulted in the passing of his parents, and that is when Batman took him under his wing and trained him to be Robin. This time it's the Killer Croc's fault. Very original, DC. I see what you did there. Very nice, yes. So already this Robin seemed to be the target of Batman for being exactly like his beloved Dick Grayson. But Jason wasn't Grayson, obviously. In a retcon, he was made to be impulsive, reckless, and rageful, probably because his mentor wanted the old guy back. I'd be mad too. Now, his backstory was reworked to make him a tough street kid whose parents succumbed to a life of crime and substances, but that's not the weird retcon. After his passing at the hands of the Joker, and technically at the hands of the fans, and after his resurrection as the Red Hood, he revealed to his sidekick that the cause of his streak of white hair was the fact that Batman had made the young Robin dye his hair from red to black in order to make him look more like Dick and avoid anyone asking about this new Robin's identity. Sure, it makes some sense, but my god, Batman needs to learn how to be a better Bat Dad.
Number 2. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were never mutants. If you have been subscribers to our channel for a while, then you likely saw this one coming from a mile away. A list of the worst retcons with Amanda hosting it? I wonder what she's gonna rank high up on that list. And you were right. One of the worst retcons in mutant history for me will always be this. During the events of Axis, it was revealed that Wanda Maximoff and her brother Pyotr, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver respectively, were never the children of Magneto, and as such, never mutants. Instead, we learned that the High Evolutionary abducted them when they were young, experimented on them, and then disguised them as mutants and returned them back to the world. Why? Well, we don't really know, which is part of the reason this is such a terrible retcon. That, and it erased years of meaningful family drama and history, and created a bunch of plot points that no longer really made any sense. Number 1. Snap Wilson. Even worse than my own personal nerd rage towards the retcon of the Maximoff twins, everyone's outrage, my own included, against this retcon. I still can't believe this was a thing that even happened in the comics. Oh my goodness. Sam Wilson in the comics became a good friend of Captain America and was even known as his ally, the superhero Falcon. However, it was revealed that Sam Wilson wasn't actually Sam Wilson, a social worker from New York with falconry skills. This was all a fabrication of the Red Skull, who had used the cosmic cube to turn him into the perfect partner for Captain America as part of an insidious plot. The true persona of Wilson was the criminal, thug, and pimp known as Snap Wilson. What? This would be revealed to Cap as being his true persona, which Cap would then save him from. Yikes. Fortunately, years later we would see a retcon that would basically undo this one, turning the fake persona of Sam Wilson into the real persona for him, and the originally retconned real persona of Snap Wilson into the fake, meaning that Sam Wilson was always Sam Wilson and Snap Wilson was the version created and used by Red Skull. Whew, thank goodness. Number 10. Hank Pym's secret daughter. Nadia Van Dyne is Hank's daughter, who we didn't know existed until 2016. She was introduced in a free comic book day issue about Civil War II. Now of course I like Nadia Van Dyne as a character, don't get me wrong, but her being added in retroactively as Hank's lost daughter was something that I felt like was a bit much. When we learned of Nadia's backstory, we learned that she was the daughter of Hank Pym and his first wife, Maria Travoia. Maria was kidnapped during her and Hank's honeymoon and killed. Nadia ended up being raised in Russia, trained in the Red Room. Eventually she escaped after learning of who her parents really were. By the time she got back to America though to see her father, Nadia learned of his sacrifice to save the world from Ultron and his death as a result. She decided to seek out her stepmother Janet Van Dyne and became close enough to her that she felt compelled to change her own last name to Van Dyne, because that's not confusing at all. She's Hank's daughter, she's not at all related to Janet, and yet she has her last name. Number 9. Falcon's X-Gene. Remember that time Falcon was revealed to be a mutant and then we explained that origin away with, a faulty Sentinel? If you don't, let me explain. In issue 174 of Captain America, we see Professor X meeting Falcon and Cap. Charles implied Falcon's connection to his bird seemed telepathic, and that Falcon's telepathic abilities may be mutant in origin. Falcon himself took this suggestion to heart and even considered what it might mean for him to be a mutant, pondering on his strong, seemingly psychic link to his bird Redwing. He then encountered a Sentinel who identified him as a mutant, and so he was a mutant for a time. This was established, and this wouldn't really be revisited or retouched till 2001, where the idea of Falcon being a mutant was tossed in the trash and explained away as a Sentinel simply malfunctioning. Wah wah wah. Number 8. Black Widow's confusing backstory. Natasha being a mysterious spy from Russia who switched sides means that yes, we are going to get a complex backstory for her, but it actually wasn't always that complex. Natasha was inspired to fight for her nation originally when her husband was assumed dead in combat. Her husband wasn't really dead of course, and it was implied that this was all part of a plot to basically encourage her to fight for her country. Before that, Natasha was a renowned ballerina. Later on, however, this whole origin was revealed to be a lie when we learned that the Red Room had embedded memories of her being a ballerina in her mind. They made her think she had trained in ballet, but she hadn't really, because I guess that's what the Red Room does, they mess with you and give you fake memories. Her story was also changed from a woman who was inspired by her husband's sacrifice to put her own life on the line for her country as well, to that of a woman being blackmailed and threatened into becoming a spy in order to protect her husband. Number 7. Zorn. Okay, so I was actually going to make the title of this point a little more explanatory, but then I realized how long that would actually make the title of this point. Okay, so Zorn was basically a character who showed up in the comics who was a mutant who always needed to wear a mask. Because of this, we never saw Zorn's face, leading many to wonder who was really under the mask. Although I think most people just thought, well, it's probably a new mutant because, we get new mutants added to the comics every day. But no, of course, this is comics, so it had to be someone. In a dramatic twist, it was Magneto. But no, of course, this is comics, so it had to be someone that we already knew. In a dramatic twist, it was revealed to be Magneto, who had infiltrated Xavier's school in order to rally up mutant support and help him create an army. He then destroyed New York, shot Emma Frost, killed Jean, and was eventually killed by Wolverine. Later on, however, Magneto would turn up again because, well, he's Magneto, and writers wanted to inch him closer to that line between villain and anti-hero again, so they basically retconned Magneto's involvement in all of this. It turns out there was a real Zorn, and it was actually Zorn's brother impersonating Zorn, impersonating Magneto, who was really to blame. Wow. Just wow. Number 6. Thanos. Number 1 dad? Thanos has never really been known as a caring and kind person. Even the people he keeps close to him are never really fully safe from his wrath. Faithful servants, family members, to Thanos, everyone is pretty much disposable. The same could be said for his adopted daughter Gamora, who he hardened and transformed into a killer until she ended up later rebelling. In the 2019 Thanos series, however, we learn how Gamora's relationship with her father was, well, more complex. How he actually, in his own way, was kind of a good father to her. This series also highlights how much they both cared for each other, despite the fact that an Infinity Gauntlet, which happened in the 90s, pre this series, but in terms of continuity would have taken place after this, Thanos seems to not show any regard for his adopted daughter's life. So, it's kind of a retcon. Doesn't make a lot of sense.
Number 5. Identity. Identity Crisis was a really engaging mystery story that paid great close attention to comic book history, but unfortunately, it is another one of DC's strange retconning events that changed quite a few things that left readers completely flabbergasted. Whether it was the super unnecessary and inappropriate use of Dr. Light's attack on Sue Dibney, which itself was an example of the crappy way women were treated in comic book stories in order to motivate the male hero, aka fridging, or the Justice League approved mind wipes that seemed kind of evil in the grand scheme of things. Sure, wiping Dr. Light's mind and turning him into essentially an idiot for what he did maybe seemed darkly justified, but wiping Batman as well? It caused Bruce to create the Brother MK1 satellite, which eventually became Brother I and created the Omax. Catwoman also suspected that her personality shift from villain to basically a hero might not have been her own choice. It caused the villain community to band together over the fear of being mind wiped, leading Lex Luthor to create the Society, and it even caused the falling apart of the Justice League. Also, can DC stop calling every damn event a crisis? I am in crisis just trying to keep track of them all.
Number 4. Spider Destiny. Now you know me, I love the Spider-Verse, I love spider totems, but not all fans share my bizarre obsession with the Spider-Verse and Spider-Geddon stories and the villains known as the Inheritors. I swear I'm like the only person that really loves the Inheritors. If you also love them, let me know in the comments. Show yourselves. With these stories came a pretty huge retcon, which basically implied via learning about the Great Web and the spider totems placed within it that every spider, man, or person had a kind of destiny to become that spider person. In other words, Peter Parker didn't have a freak accident, he was actually destined to become Spider-Man. It was fate! Many fans were not a fan of this change to his origins, as they felt it detracted from what makes Peter Parker so appealing. That he's just an average kid who got a freak spider bite that gave him powers, as opposed to it being all ordained.
Number 3. Dead or Alive. Superboy issue 158 came out in 1949, so it was a little while back now. And the cover of the issue is enough to pull any reader in. It shows Superboy in space looking down at a capsule with his parents in it. And the words, "They're alive, my real mother and father." And behold, a couple of sleeping beauties. Jor-El and Lara were drifting in space for 15 years. The radio transmission comes in, calling Kal-El, and then he's like, yo, that's my name, let's do it, let's go. And it's a nice moment or two. Superboy reflects on recognizing his parents' voices, even though he was just a wee baby when he last saw them. So how sweet. But in the New 52 Rebirth storylines, apparently Jor-El survived the Krypton explosion, thanks to Dr. Manhattan, and he then became Mr. Oz, who was like a villain. This New 52 retcon makes absolute no sense. We saw Krypton's death, and we also saw his parents dying in it with our eyes.
Number 2. Aunt May's death. Remember when Aunt May died, but it wasn't really Aunt May, but an actress who had actually died while impersonating Aunt May? Yeah. That was a weird villainous plot. What we saw in the comics as an elderly Aunt May's death was later retconned into being one of the weirdest and most elaborate plots of Green Goblin's criminal career. It was later revealed that the woman who was dead and buried and who we thought had been Aunt May was actually an elderly actress who happened to be on her deathbed and who had agreed to take on one last role in order to torment Spider-Man? Prove how great of an actress she was? Her motives are pretty foggy. Maybe Green Goblin agreed to pay any surviving relatives of hers a ton of cash? I honestly don't know. What had really happened was this actress had been genetically altered to exactly match Aunt May's genes, meaning no one at the hospital suspected this imposter to be a fake. She died after revealing to Peter that she knew he was Spider-Man and was even buried in Aunt May's intended plot next to Uncle Ben for a time. That is, of course, until we all learned that Aunt May was really still alive and this had been some kind of bizarre ruse. Number 1. Clone Saga. I won't deny that in my time on this channel I've come to actually somewhat love elements of the Clone Saga. I originally disliked Clone Saga when I started working here, but I very much have come to appreciate parts of the story and to acknowledge that without Clone Saga, we wouldn't have some very awesome characters like Ben Reilly and Kane Parker. However, one thing I still cannot get over is how long Marvel spent tricking everyone with this story. People spent 20 years thereabouts thinking they were reading Spider-Man, as in Peter Parker, only to find out that all those stories were not his, but actually belonged to a clone. Granted, at least it was a pretty cool clone who we'd all come to love after. But at the time, this was a pretty shocking and frustrating revelation after years of stories, and it left a lot of fans feeling betrayed at the time.
Kicking off the list at number 10. Superman's Secret. Ooh. So in Superman issue 300 back in 1939, we see the front cover of this issue and it shows in big text, "Revealed at last, the startling secret of how Superman fools the world with his Clark Kent identity." And you see Superman on the cover like, "Lana, look at my face. Do you believe me?" He's on point, like he's very aggressive. He's like, "I'm Clark Kent, look at my face." It's basically what we've all been thinking when we see this guy in his disguise. The whole issue is about how dumb the glasses disguise is. And it's pretty funny at first. But the thing that sucked was that he explained how his glasses are made from Kryptonian plexiglass and how that intensifies the low-level hypnotic effect, so people see him as Clark Kent rather than Superman. So he can be dressed in his gear and people are like, "No, you're definitely Clark Kent, I'm looking right at you. Your chest is the size of a car, but you know what? I think you're still Clark Kent." It wasn't until Byrne's 1986 reboot until this power was dropped. Thankfully. Because if they'd kept that idea, then it would have made the comics where Bruce Wayne pretends to be Superman pretty unnecessary. Also, if Superman has these powers in comics or movies, that would just be hilarious. It would just be Henry Cavill at the bar in his Superman gear just flexing, then a guy pours a beer on his head while we're just staring at him in costume. That would have just been weird. That guy should have been punched out to space also. Forget about his truck being stuck in trees. He should have grabbed him and just went, gone. Number 9, One Punch Man. Superboy Prime punches through reality itself. It is one of the most talked about events in DC's comic book history, and it has fans split over the overall decision. Crisis on Infinite Earths happened and brought together all these Golden Age and Silver Age heroes into the same place. It was a move made to retcon certain plot points while setting up a brighter and certainly bolder future. So what happens when you lock Superboy Prime up in a pocket universe? Well, once he's out, he gets so mad that he punches, but he doesn't just punch a hole in the wall like your classic Kyle from high school. No. He punches through reality, creating the multiverse, bringing back the dead Robin from the 80s, Jason Todd, to life. And that wasn't the only change though when it comes to the multiverse collapsing. Like Elastigirl's resurrection, and then the other characters come back as if they truly never died. Like we had Lynx, Reactron, Ventriloquist, Scarface, and Magpie. This punch also changed some major history with Joe Chill, which I'll get into later. The numerous versions of General Zod were also replaced by just the one version. So, what a mess. Just what a mess. Number 8, Catwoman's origin. Okay, this one's super funny to me. So, Frank Miller released Batman Year 1, and it was this dark and gritty issue. And included with it had Selena Kyle's true origins. She lived life on the streets and resorted to work just to make ends meet. People loved this dark origin story. This was a superhero origin story. Then the New 52 released Catwoman 0 in 2011, and the origin went from dark and DC-like to just, well, this. She is seen as this amateur thief, and she has an epiphany while falling out of a window, and she smacks the ground quite hard. And then, out of nowhere, a group of stray cats appear and start to lick her back to life. Look at her face, getting all sticky. First of all, the sound. Second of all, the smell. Wouldn't be the best. Basically just doing what Tim Burton did, but on the page. No way.
Number 7, the Justice Society. One of the most hated retcons to come out of the New 52 was that DC made it so that the Justice Society of America, a well-respected team that included popular characters from the golden age of comics, that was a huge part of DC's comic book history, both in the actual continuity and real life, had just never existed. It's just such an odd choice, as the legacy aspect of DC Comics that these characters served as the basis for was just completely wiped out. That legacy concept had done so well for DC prior to the past decade, so it seemed like such a strange choice to make. DC made a few weird choices with regards to retcons created during the New 52. Some were loved, some were not, but to fans, this one seemed just straight up rude. Just because Jay Garrick and Alan Scott are old news doesn't mean they aren't as important. Respect your elders, DC. Come on!
Number 6, Identity Crisis. Brad Meltzer's Identity Crisis was a 7-part issue released back in 2004. The first issue actually did really well with pre-orders, passing I think like 160,000. But come issue 2, fans weren't nearly as interested the first time around. There was a huge decline in numbers. Why though? Well, the cruelty of the content was deemed a bit too much for comic book readers at the time. It had basically turned into a murder mystery about the death of Sue Dibney. Fans weren't on board with how dark the story got with certain details, some drawing the conclusion that it was done just for shock value. Fans have said that every character involved in that comic was just ruined. So what do you guys think? Agree, disagree? Comment down below.
Number 5, Doom is never wrong. Some people like Dr. Doom a little too much. I'm probably guilty as being one of those people. To the point that they can't let him be flawed. Doom must be perfect. Well, while Doom may believe that, the reality is it's his flaws that actually help to make him such a great character, and also are important because they are a part of the reason for his villainous nature. Originally, his vendetta started against the Fantastic Four, and more specifically Reed Richards, years ago, when Reed tried to give him pointers on a device he was building. Reed warned Doom that it was unstable, but Doom didn't listen. The device ended up exploding because, well, Richards had been right, scarring Doom's face. Unable to blame himself due to his huge ego, Doom decided to blame Reed, and thus a villain was born. However, retcons have come into play a few times in regards to his origins as to whose fault the device exploding really was. In one retcon, it's actually implied that it's Mephisto's fault, but if that's true, then why has Doom hated Reed so much for pretty much forever? Another retcon implied that Ben Grimm possibly intentionally sabotaged Doom's machine, which is an even worse retcon because it makes Grimm, normally a very lovable character, look like a jerk. Both of these retcons help to buff out Doom's flaws at the expense of making his feuds illogical.
Number 4, what is love? More like, where is love? Green Arrow and Black Canary are an iconic couple, or rather, were. The two have been together since their early issues in the 60s, and then the reboot came along in 2011, and they weren't lovers anymore. What? For 5 years, readers had to watch them not be in love, and it was a weird time. Eventually DC listened, and then when DC Rebirth happened, the couple was back together again. Now this made fans happy, of course, but that was 5 years of storytelling, and now those issues are just scrapped. Awesome, sick, 5 years. A lot of words, a lot of eye movements. Thanks.
Number 3, Kang. Sometimes we talk about retcons that are ridiculous because they hurt the overall story. Other times there are retcons that feel like they don't really need to happen, and then there are those that just cause more confusion than really necessary. That's sort of the case with Kang. Kang the Conqueror was a villain who was first introduced in Avengers issue 8 in 1964. He is known for being a time-traveling villain who enjoys sitting and floating around while menacing other people. As time went on, however, we'd come to discover due to the fact that he's a time traveler, the Kang was actually a bunch of other people, including Immortus and even Iron Lad. While these retcons were sometimes interesting, they don't really add much to his story, and at this point Kang being revealed as just about anyone is so old hat, it's kind of lost its shock value as well. Now we're gonna get him in the MCU. I don't know what that's gonna be like. Could be weird, could be great.
Number 2, Jack and Joe. We all know the name Joe Chill, the guy who killed Bruce Wayne's parents, Martha and Thomas Wayne. Now after watching the 1989 Tim Burton Batman film, there's now another name in our minds when we think of the person that killed his parents. We of course think back to the Joker, and having him as the one who killed his parents in the movie, so which is the right one? Which one's true? So fans had to wonder this for years. If Joe Chill was actually the killer, these are confusing times. And then in Infinite Crisis issue 6, we see that Chill is again the killer of the Wayne's family. Thankfully, I mean, part of Batman's story was based off this way of things. And after Infinite Crisis, they made it so Chill was arrested the same night he killed Bruce Wayne's parents. These stories are way too confusing at times. Even reading this, my brain hurts. And finally, number 1, no kill. We all know Batman by his one rule, and breaking that rule is Joker's goal in the Dark Knight film, to never kill. Of course, having his parents die at the hands of a killer, one would assume he's not too fond of the act. But let's go back to Batman's first appearance. Back in 1939, Detective Comics issue 27, we straight up see Bruce push a guy into acid. Acid! It's said in the early days that many criminals died by the hands of the Bat. Bill Finger came in and retconned it so the Caped Crusader, starting in Batman issue 6, tells Robin that we never kill with weapons of any kind. With weapons? Ooh, gotta read the fine print, I don't know. No, Batman at that point still goes by the no kill rule. But what do you guys think? Was his actions, like in Batman vs Superman, unwarranted? I mean, this is obviously a darker, older version of the Batman where clearly people close to him have died. I personally think he should kill. Make it so he pops dudes. People love the Punisher. I mean, you know, he wrecks people. Go get him, Batsy.
Number 10, the Three Jokers. At the bottom of our list is the Three Jokers story. This is because it isn't canon to the main DC universe, but the setup is. When Batman became the god of knowledge by sitting on the Mobius chair, he became able to find out the answer to any question he asked. One of the first things he wanted to know was the true identity of his archenemy, the Joker. To his surprise, the chair informed him that the Joker was actually 3 different men. This was never really explored in main continuity, but in the Black Label story The Three Jokers, we learned that the reason the Joker acts so differently depending on the day is that Batman has been dealing with 3 different Jokers, known as the Clown, who was the Joker who killed Jason Todd, the Comedian, the Joker who shot and paralyzed Barbara Gordon, and the Criminal, who seems to be the Golden Age version of the character. The writer, Jeff Johns, stated that it was because it was so revolutionary, it would be out of canon with the option of bringing it into the main universe once fans inevitably loved it, comparing his story to Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, which went through a similar process. Personally, I think it's best this stays in Elseworlds, as it just opens up too many questions about Batman's already kinda weird continuity.
Number 9, Martian Manhunter. Put some respect on my boy's name. In the New 52 era, one of the biggest changes made to the Justice League was that Martian Manhunter was not a founding member of the team, a place that he held for years. Instead, his spot was taken by Cyborg, who was now created thanks to a mother box. This had a ripple effect of changing the important place Cyborg held in the Teen Titans, meaning it was erased completely. I personally liked the change a little bit. I always have felt that Cyborg has been a little underappreciated, so to make him a founding member felt like a huge step up for his character, who is one of my favorites. But at the same time, John is also one of my favorites. It's just that his status as a newly arrived alien from Mars made it make more sense that Cyborg, who has lived a relatively normal human life on Earth, should be the one of the original defenders of the planet. It may be a weak argument, and I know that many people weren't too happy with the changes to both the JLA and the Titans. Let me know your thoughts.
Number 8, Hal Jordan, from hero to villain to host. Hal Jordan was one of the most beloved and respected members of the Green Lantern Corps. When his home, Coast City, was destroyed by supervillains, he was consumed by grief. He tried to recreate his city and its inhabitants with his ring, but as this was against the ring rules, he was summoned by the Guardians of the Universe for judgment. He snapped and killed pretty much the entire Green Lantern Corps, taking their rings in hopes of becoming so powerful that he could restart the universe and save his city. He started calling himself Parallax and was now a villain. He eventually learned the error of his ways and sacrificed himself to save the day and died. DC eventually wanted to bring him back as Green Lantern, but realized that would be really hard with him having committed so much genocide since he was a hero. They retconned it so that he was actually being influenced by a yellow fear demon named Parallax who had taken over his mind. This allowed Hal to rejoin the Green Lanterns, be a member of the Justice League, and become the Lantern's golden boy again by absolving him of any responsibility for his actions.
Number 7. After the New 52 retcon, we saw Barbara Gordon in an entirely new way. So Alan Moore released The Killing Joke, and in this comic we see a paralyzed Barbara Gordon from the waist down. She then became Oracle and did a pretty bang up job with the Bat family. Also, she's in a wheelchair. How often do you see that? More inclusion for the win, folks. Let's get it. But with the New 52 retcon, we have Barbara Gordon back as Batgirl. So while some fans are happy with the change, most have expressed quite a bit of rage online, rightfully so.
Number 6, Tim Drake. Robin no more? When the DC universe rebooted into the New 52 continuity, DC editorial wanted to make their heroes younger and changed the continuity so that the Justice League had only been operating for 5 years. If they had wanted to start the New 52 with Batman working solo or with Dick Grayson still being Robin, this probably would have worked. But DC wanted to have their cake and eat it too, wanting a younger Batman, but still wanting to use characters like Nightwing and Jason Todd. In order to accommodate the new timeline, retcons to the various Robins' backstories had to be made. Dick and Jason got away relatively unscathed, but Tim Drake got the short end of the stick. Tim was originally introduced after Jason Todd had died at the hands of the Joker. Batman was acting recklessly, and Tim deduced that Batman was Bruce Wayne. Believing that Batman needs a Robin to temper his aggression, he asked asked Dick to become Robin again, but ended up getting the gig himself, being the main boy wonder from 1990 until 2009 when Damian Wayne became the new Robin and Tim Drake became Red Robin. In New 52 canon, he never quite figured out Batman's identity and was never Robin, having apparently always been Red Robin. Fans hated this, and his original origin was eventually put back into canon. Another consequence of the New 52 was that in order to explain how Batman had a 10-year-old son, Damian was retconned to be a genetically engineered baby who had grown faster than normal.
Number 5. Spider-Man's non-sister. So this is kind of another retcon that for me is similar to Nadia's. I like the idea of this character, but the whole story involving her is, well, it's pretty wacky. Teresa showed up in Amazing Spider-Man Family Business claiming to be Teresa Parker, Peter's sister. She believed she was the daughter of Richard and Mary Parker, Peter's parents, and we got a few cool adventures with her, assuming this belief to be true. She was retconned into existence, but honestly, I thought she was kind of a cool retcon to add in, so I was cool with that. However, things got weirder when we learned that the secret sister we'd never heard of till now was all a lie, and that Teresa actually wasn't who she said she was, despite what she herself had been manipulated to believe. It was all a trick, and Mentalo had manipulated Teresa into believing it herself. It was all part of Kingpin's plan to basically lure Peter to a tomb. And we don't actually even know who Teresa's parents are now. It's still a mystery. They even manipulated how Peter saw Teresa, making her appear more like him, so she'd look more like his sister. It's weird. I wish she was actually his sister. That would have been cooler, I think.
Number 4. Jay Garrick. Fictional or nah? When Barry Allen was introduced in 1956 as a reinvention of the Flash, they explained that in Barry's universe, the original Flash, Jay Garrick, and all of his adventures were the fictional exploits of a comic book superhero that Barry liked growing up. So when Barry got powers, he took on the identity to honor him, making the Flash a cosplayer. This was retconned in the iconic Flash of Two Worlds story from 1961's Flash number 123, where Barry accidentally was transported to Jay's world. He learned that Jay was in a different universe, and that the comics written by Gardner Fox were actually dreams that he had remembered and written down. As Barry explained, obviously when the writer was asleep, his mind was turned in on Jay's vibratory Earth. This was a weird way to incorporate Jay Garrick, but it also had long-running effects on the larger DC universe, as this is also the introduction of the DC multiverse.
Number 3. Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy's relationship. This little frightening retcon was added during the Sins Past story. It also made Peter look like an insensitive jerk, just for good measure as well. The story here that was added in was that Gwen Stacy had an affair with Norman Osborn, a man who was much older than her at the time and who would go on to be responsible for her death. This affair resulted in Gwen becoming pregnant with twins, which she secretly gave birth to. Norman then raised these children, lying to them that they were actually the children of Spider-Man and Gwen, and that Spider-Man had killed their mother, turning them into misguided villains. This was not a retcon anyone needed, but hey, it was one that we got.
Number 2. Punching reality. In one of DC Comics' first and largest moves, the publisher removed all of the parallel Earths that they created during the Bronze, Silver, and Golden Age of comics in the Crisis on Infinite Earths. This was controversial even at the time, as it was a huge move that was meant to streamline their continuity and bring everything into one Earth. Unfortunately, the whole move was pretty pointless because it didn't take DC long to go back on that idea and retcon it, but they did it in what was honestly an incredibly odd way. We're talking comic books here, so there is a large suspension of disbelief that needs to take place, but making Superboy Prime punch reality just seems on another level. Being from an alternate reality himself, he got so mad at the current state of affairs in the DC universe that he punched a hole in reality, which created the multiverse again and started the incredibly complex history of DC continuity, which only recently was reverted so that literally everything is canon if you want it to be. We did a whole explained on the DC continuity, so if you want to check that out, we will add a link for you right somewhere over here.
Number 1. Hawkman's origin. Hawkman has one of the most notoriously difficult origins to keep track of in all of comics, so I will be giving you an abridged version of his history. In his original 1940 origin, he is Egyptian royalty who has been reincarnated throughout time as a variety of different heroes before eventually becoming the archaeologist Carter Hall, spelled like this. Carter becomes Hawkman and fights crime. With me so far? When reintroduced in 1961, he is an alien cop from the planet Thanagar named Carter Hall, spelt like this. He comes to Earth and takes on the secret identity of an archaeologist named Carter Hall, with the original spelling. It makes sense when you think of him as a total reinvention of the original character. Where things start to get confusing is 2 years later when we learn that the two different versions are actually multiversal variants of each other, with the alien living on Earth 1 and the original archaeologist being on Earth 2. In 1986, the Crisis on Infinite Earths happens, and all of the worlds are combined into one. How to handle the continuity? Well, they changed it so that they were two different people who just happened to have similar sounding names and were both Hawkman at different points in history, with the original operating in the 40s and the alien operating in the 80s. In 1994, 0 Hour happens and all of the various Hawkmen become one guy, but it doesn't stick. In 2011, the New 52 retcons Hawkman so that he has always been a space cop from Thanagar. In 2017, Carter with a C is reintroduced, with it being explained that he reincarnates because the knife he was killed with in Egypt was made of nth metal from a Thanagarian ship, kind of introducing elements of both of the origins. In 2018, we learned that the two versions have become one again, with the space cop being one of Carter with a C's reincarnations, retconning the character to be able to be reborn not just in different eras on Earth, but on other planets as well. So, to sum it up briefly, reincarnated Pharaoh becomes space cop, becomes two different people. He's retconned to have only ever been a space cop, and is retconned one last time to be a reincarnated Pharaoh who in one of his lives was an alien space cop. Which, when you say it like that, makes perfect sense. By the way, most of this can also be applied to Hawkgirl.
Number 10. Gwen's secret children. Norman Osborn slept with Gwen and they had twins in secret together. Shocking? You bet it was. But that is exactly what happened in this very strange retcon from Sins Past. It featured a reveal as well that Peter Parker was not in fact Gwen's first, which seemingly broke Pete's heart, despite the fact that it's been, years since Gwen has been alive at this point, and the fact that it's kind of just a weird thing to focus on, honestly, when it comes to this revelation. Especially when it comes to the caveat that your dead ex also apparently had twins in secret with one of your greatest enemies, and the person who ultimately, kind of killed her. I mean, you could say that Spider-Man killed her. You can debate that all you want, but I think Norman's presence was pretty crucial in that. And now, those twins have grown up, and they also think that you're their father and that you're responsible for their mother's death. So, all in all, just a weird thing for Pete to focus on, and just a very weird retcon in general. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here, and if you love when I get to smash the retcon button and talk about retcons, be sure to smash that like button to let us know you like it. Number 9. Kindred's Revelation. As weird as the previous retcon from Sins Past was, the good news is it's been retconned out of existence. Haha! This all happened during the end of Nick Spencer's run on The Amazing Spider-Man on ASM. In ASM issue number 73, which I honestly just collected because of this, it's explained to Norman by his son Harry, or I guess his son's vengeful kind of new demonic form, that Harry teamed up with Mendel Stromm and Mysterio when he was still alive to create an extremely convincing illusion, making it seem as though Norman had slept with Gwen when he actually hadn't. Gabriel and Sarah Stacy were actually not anyone's children, but simply test tube clones created based off of Norman and Gwen's combined genes. Kind of a weird retcon, but also kind of a great one. Number 8. Black Widow's Origins. Black Widow used to be a ballerina. Or at least she used to be. Initially, Black Widow's origins was that she was a ballerina who married the Russian super soldier superhero Red Guardian, and after he went MIA and was basically presumed dead, getting blowed up, she decided to join up and fight for her country, inspired and impassioned into patriotic dedication by his sacrifice and unfortunate fate. However, it turned out that he never really died, but that Russia had it appear as though he did in order to manipulate Natasha into becoming one of their agents. However, then it was retconned that Natasha never really even was a ballerina at all, but merely these had been memories implanted into her mind by the Red Room, whom she was in the care of actually for most of her life, at least according to one of the accounts of the various versions of her origins. It's also been implied that she was not actually inspired to join up with the USSR following the supposed death of her husband, but instead was blackmailed into doing so. Basically, her origin is one that we seem to constantly revisit and tweak, so it's kinda hard to keep up with. To be honest, I kinda wish she had actually just got to be a real former ballerina turned spy, because that just sounds like a cool origin story to me, but hey, implanted memories.
In at number 7, the Ant-Man and the Wasp's abuse storyline. So the Fresh Start Initiative also brought forth a new volume of Ant-Man and the Wasp, and issue 1 from 2018 sought to readjust the past turmoil between Janet Van Dyne and Hank Pym, or at least kind of smother it in the past and not make us think about it. We're specifically talking about the wife-beating comic The Avengers issue 213 from 1981, in which Hank beats Janet when she tries to question his intentions. 1981 was not a good year for Hank, or the years before that either. Hank had a rough time in the Silver and Bronze Age, people. He had gone schizophrenic and became the Yellow Jacket persona, got court-martialed by the Avengers after senselessly beating a foe who had surrendered, and then concocted a plan to get their approval and fix things. Janet was like, sorry, what? And then tried to reason with him, so instead he backhands her and sends her flying. Let's see that in any MCU film, that's for sure. So in the 2018 Ant-Man and the Wasp issue 1, their origin story and love story is recounted, but the abuse is blatantly left out, replaced with, they shared a love so bright it shamed the stars.
Number 6. Franklin's origins. Franklin Richards is the son of Susan Storm Richards and Reed Richards. He is a member of the Fantastic Four and Future Foundation family, alongside his sister Valeria. While Valeria doesn't possess any superpowers of her own, at least not yet, although she is insanely smart, one of the smartest people in the Marvel Universe in fact, Franklin actually does have superpowers. Or he did. His powers are considered to be off the charts, or you know, at least they were. Franklin Richards had insanely powerful reality warping abilities that had been causing bouts of chaos, while also sometimes being insanely useful, ever since he was a baby. It was also believed that these powers were the result of him having an active and powerful mutant gene. However, as Franklin's powers recently struggled to remain consistent and eventually faded with time, he not only lost the powers, but he also lost his mutant status, which was revealed to be a result of him subconsciously reality warping his own DNA. This has made a lot of Fantastic Four fans upset, but also I'm still hoping it's leading us to something else. I'm still hoping it won't be a retcon forever and that something will shift. Maybe they had to do that because Franklin's going to be coming to the MCU and they were like, he can't be this powerful. We must nerf him in the comics.
Moving on to number 5, Hal Jordan as Parallax. Once upon a time, during the horrible reign of the Superman story arc that was the sequel to the even more horrible Death of the Superman story arc, I had to bring it up, Hal Jordan lost his shit after his home of Coast City was destroyed by Mongol and Cyborg Superman. This occurred in Green Lantern issue 46 and would become known as the Emerald Twilight story arc. A few issues later, completely distressed by Coast City being obliterated, Hal decides to use his power ring to try to recreate it, which is a big no-no for Green Lanterns. The Guardians of the Universe summon him for breaking the rule of using his ring for personal gain, which pisses Hal off even more. So he steals energy from the main power battery on the Guardians planet in order to finish recreating Coast City. The Green Lantern Corps have no choice but to stop him, but Hal ends up killing most of them, stealing each of their rings and leaving many for dead. It's then revealed in issue 50 that he's actually Parallax, the fear space insect of sorts. The literal embodiment of fear. Hal then sacrifices himself in the Final Night story arc, but then 10 years later Green Lantern gets a reboot and everything is retconned. Hal was just possessed, something that Batman would never really let him live down.
Number 4. Spider totems. I explain them a lot on this channel whenever we talk about them because honestly, they're kinda weird and most people are like, what's that? What's a spider totem? To be fair, I do personally love what they have done as a concept for the Spider-Verse, basically bringing together like all the alternate versions of Spider-Man. So there's that, and I think that is a good part of them. So, okay, what are spider totems? Where did they come from? Why? Why? Well, spider totems are basically characters who are attached to the great web of life and destiny, who themselves are imbued with fated, spider-like powers thanks to their connection to, in essence, kinda like spider gods, who each represent a different archetype. With the concept of spider totems, Spider-Man and other related characters with spider-like abilities went from being heroes as the result of a freak, radioactive, accidental spider bite, or some other, freak occurrence, to becoming heroes of destiny and fate. Some people like it, some people don't. But it is a thing that exists, and we must acknowledge.
In at number 3, Karen Page. Are you guys familiar with Women in Refrigerators? It was a website started back in 1999 by author Gail Simone that highlighted all of the ways that female characters characters had been mistreated in comics. It had become a trope. The female characters were often used to progress a male character's narrative, and were subject to brutal murders, intense injuries, rape, or were just flat out depowered. Anywho, the exact concept can be applied to this ridiculous retcon surrounding Daredevil's lady pal Karen Page. Karen was given some pretty crappy treatment. She was made into a prostitute, was given AIDS, which turns out was all an illusion thanks to Mysterio, and then died in Matt Murdock's arms after Bullseye killed her. All in all, Karen was retconned from a character who went to California and began a successful acting career to a character who became addicted to heroin and starred in pornos. From Daredevil issue 227 onwards, it just gets worse and worse for Karen. Poor girl.
Number 2. Silk and Spider-Man. This is a really weird one, but thank goodness we've moved past it at this point, and even Dan Slott has admitted remorse for this weird plot point that was added into Silk's origins, as well as some other initial elements of her character that played into racial stereotypes. He has openly stated that if he even could go back in time, knowing what he knows now and hearing what he's heard from readers, he would have written things a lot differently. Honestly, a refreshing take to hear from a writer when it comes to a weird retcon that was not positively received. Silk is Cindy Moon. She was bitten by the same radioactive spider as Peter and also received spider-like abilities. Due to her and Peter sharing the connection of the same spider, which gave them their powers, she and Peter, for some pheromonal reason, had an uncontrollable desire for and attraction to one another. And I really do mean uncontrollable here. All in all, it was a weird thing that was pretty icky, to be honest, but fortunately we moved past that, and the connection no longer makes either spider-based superhero act like a horn dog around the other, so yay. Progress. Number 1. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver's origins. Well, if you know me, you knew that we were going to talk about this because I must talk about it at every opportunity. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver have had a tumultuous origins, to say the least. Initially, they were the children of Maria and Django Maximoff, who became indebted to Magneto as young mutants after their lives were saved from an angry mob. Quicksilver's mutant powers allowed him to move and think at super speed, and Scarlet Witch's powerful but unpredictable mutant powers allowed her to hex her enemies, and sometimes honestly her allies, even warping reality at times to do so. They were initially portrayed as kinda bad luck powers in the comics, but would evolve to become more seemingly magical, being referred to as chaos magic, and also becoming powerful enough to allow her to warp the reality of an entire universe. We'd learn eventually that the Maximoff twins were not truly the children of the Maximoffs, but were simply adopted by the couple. They were the secret twins of Magda, Magneto's wife, making them, yes, Magneto's children. This would create a tense and interesting relationship between the three, with their family ties shaping much of their personality, complexes, and history throughout the years, and adding a lot of depth to Magneto's character. However, Marvel wanted to bring these two into the MCU. At the time, this was complicated, as Wanda and Pietro were mutants, which put them in a weird contested limbo, with Fox claiming rights to them due to them owning X-Men rights at the time, and Marvel claiming rights to them for film projects due to their frequent attachment to the Avengers, and you know, they've never really been X-Men, so yeah. In order to make it so that Marvel could easily use the twins without it being contested in the MCU, they decided to detach them even further from mutant kind by retconning their origins during the events of Axis. With her alignment accidentally magically reversed as the result of a spell she herself had helped to cast, Wanda used blood magic to torment her own relatives, Quicksilver and Magneto, who were basically trying to talk her down at the time. While this worked on Pietro, it did not work on Eric, proving that he was not really their father. The High Evolutionary provided further clarification in regards to this retcon, with it being explained that the Maximoffs were actually their real parents, with the High Evolutionary merely disguising them as mutants after abducting them and experimenting on them while they were young, which also granted them their powers. Later, Quicksilver would be implied to also possibly be an Inhuman, and Scarlet Witch's powers would be firmly cemented as straight up magic strengthened by her own Romani bloodline and heritage. So nothing mutant about either of them, apparently. So House of M, Avengers vs. X-Men, there's a lot of things that now don't quite make sense.
Starting us off in at number 10, Wonder Woman's invisible jet. I mean, I guess she doesn't really need it anymore now, does she? Well, fear not, friends, it wasn't retconned out of existence, so y'all who love her jet, you're good. In 2018's Dark Knight's Metal issue 5, Wonder Woman's invisible jet got a brand new origin story. The Batman Who Laughs shot Wonder Woman with a bullet that was made out of 8th metal, a weaker derivative of 9th metal, which played an important role in this story arc. Anyway, as she is lying there, just all shot and stuff, he goes on a villainous tangent, in which he says, I quote, "The bullets are made of 8th metal, same as your invisible jet, if you have that on this Earth." Now, he's from an alternate Earth in the Dark Multiverse known as Earth-22, so that's that whole Earth bit there, in case you haven't read the series. Initially, when the jet was introduced in 1941, Diana had built it herself, but that was retconned to it being a semi-sentient crystalline organism that was capable of thought and shapeshifting, and now it's made out of 8th metal, so there you have it. Moving on to number 9, the mutant timeline. In 2018, the relaunch of Avengers, spearheaded by Jason Aaron and Ed McGuinness, introduced a fresh start. Get it? The Fresh Start Initiative. It retconned the mutant timeline. Now, according to this retcon, the first appearance of mutant kind occurred in 1 million BC. In Avengers issue 1, Agamotto reveals that the mutants have existed from that point in time, which would predate Apocalypse and the Externals. So yeah, that's something to think about. Apocalypse was considered to be the first mutant, like the mutant daddy of them all. I kind of regret saying that. Now, this retcon was a bit of an interesting switch, considering that during this time period, Marvel was concerned with pushing certain heroes' stories forward in time in order to de-age more of them. There's also an additional retcon in that issue where it stated that Steve Rogers had been trapped in ice for the first 40 Super Bowls, which would roughly place his de-thawing between February of 2006 and February of 2007. So, yeah, that's something to think about. Moving on to number 8, Jason Todd's dad. In Red Hood and the Outlaws issue 23 from 2018, Jason Todd, the second Robin who met a tragic fate and was resurrected, eventually becoming Red Hood, got a bit of a retcon in terms of his family history. Now, it was revealed in the issue that Jason's father, Willis, who was always a criminal, had actually worked with several of Batman's foes in Batman's Rogue Gallery, which likely further complicated things emotionally for Jason when becoming the Dark Knight's young ward. Now, prior to this, Jason's father was a petty thief who had abandoned his son and his wife, Jason's mother Sheila, who was a drug addict. Willis was believed to have had been murdered in retaliation for double-crossing Two-Face. Now in this issue though, Jason is given letters from his father that paint us a picture of a man who turned to crime in order to help his family and help his wife kick her drug habit. And he's got the scars to prove it, including a batarang-shaped one on his torso.
Number 7. Aranya's powers. Aranya is Anya Corazon. For those who are unfamiliar with her character, she is another Spider-Man-like superhero from Earth 616. Despite sharing some connection to the world of spider totems and spider-like abilities, Anya was actually a pretty unique character in the sense that her power origins were more steeped in mysticism and magic. She was given her powers and her heroic calling after saving Miguel Lagar, a sorcerer from the Spider Society. She didn't get a radioactive spider bite, she got a magical spider tattoo. Anya had powers that gave her superhuman reflexes, wall crawling abilities, and super strength, but she also had a spider-like exoskeleton that she could produce, acting like a shield around her. She also had a power known as the Spirit of the Hunter, which kind of sent her into like a berserker rage. And because of her ties to the Spider Society, she was also extremely helpful when it came to reading prophetic scrolls that the Spider Army got a hold of during the Spider-Verse event. However, during Spider Island, her powers shifted to be basically just another carbon copy of Peter's instead, with her basically not having her original powers and then her just getting like Spider-Man's powers. Although at least now with Edge and End of the Spider-Verse, Anya does seem to be recovering her original powers, so they are coming back, but it was a weird retcon, and I was just like, but it actually ties into the spider totem thing. Doesn't that make more sense? Spider totems are their own thing.
Moving on to number 6, Captain Marvel's origin story. The Life of Captain Marvel issue 3, also a 2018 release, retconned part of Carol Danvers' origin story. Carol's origin usually plays out like this. She was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, befriended Mar-Vell, the original Captain Marvel, and on one mission that she assisted him with, a device called the Psyche Magnetron blew up. Carol's nearby it, and she ends up getting her DNA spliced with Mar-Vell's, making her a half-Kree. Now, the retcon. So after Carol takes a bit of a leave after going full-blown all-in on a supervillain, she goes back to her family in Harpswell, Maine. There, things continue to go downhill. Her brother lands in a coma, and she finds a bunch of love letters written by her father to another woman who was not her mom. Yeah, A little startling there. With the letters, she also finds a hidden beacon and accidentally activates it, which sends a Kree clone warrior to Earth with the intention of killing Carol, or so we think. Here's the twist though, the clone actually wasn't after Carol, it was seeking out her mom, Marie Danvers, who was then revealed in that issue to be a Kree warrior. Connect the dots there, my friends. She was a Kree all along. Right. And at number 5, Spider-Man One More Day. Yet another wonderful retcon thanks to J. Michael Straczynski here, and Joe Quesada. So the One Day More story arc is the famous controversial story arc in which after Peter's identity is revealed publicly, Aunt May ends up getting fatally injured. In order to save her, Peter strikes up a deal with Mephisto, one of Marvel's best narrative tools when it comes to retcons, who agrees to let Aunt May live if Peter gives up his life with Mary Jane Watson. Peter does it, dissolving their marriage. It's the product of that lame cliche that superheroes don't deserve to be happily married. Anywho, the decision cost Peter his future daughter, who he got a glimpse of throughout. But it reset a lot of aspects of Parker's life, and involved a terrifying demon in order to do so. It's stupid and scary. Moving back to Marvel for our number 4 spot, Original Sin. In 2019, Cosmic Ghost Rider was all the rage. Easy to see why. He's an amalgamation between the Punisher, Ghost Rider, and technically the Silver Surfer, but not really because he becomes Galactus' herald and just has all of those Silver Surfer powers. Anyway, a series called Cosmic Ghost Rider Destroys Marvel History was released, and in issue 6 of that series it implies that the Cosmic Ghost Rider interfered with one of the publisher's major and highly disliked story arcs, Original Sin. So long story short, Cosmic Ghost Rider's story reveals a lot of beef between him and the Watcher. Now by the time Original Sin rolls around, it is revealed that this version of Frank Castle killed the Watcher rather than Nick Fury. While this doesn't change much in the grand scheme of how things played out after Original Sin, it does make you feel pretty terrible for Fury considering the fate that he was dealt with in the aftermath of that story arc. Moving on to number 3, A Man of Many Races. The Flash mantle has a history of annoying retcons over the years. One of the worst by far though is Wally West ceasing to exist, but then to Wally West existing thanks to retcon Messy Fun Time. So at the start of the New 52 and the DC Universe reboot that came with it, Wally West does not exist, or at least the one we knew didn't exist. Another new Wally West was kicking around, but he was the biracial son of Rudy West. But then that black Wally West was retconned when DC Rebirth came around, which was yet another reboot of the DC Universe, in which the original Wally West was brought back, and this Wally West, known as Wallace West, was the cousin of the original Wally West and the son of the New 52 Reverse Flash, Daniel West. He was also kicking around. Confused yet? Well, don't worry, DC explained the same name thing as a product of the two Wallys being named after their great-grandfather. But really, it was just because people were really pissed that the original Wally West had essentially disappeared, and they didn't want to get rid of the black Wally West, so they just were like, they both exist. Good job, DC, good job. In at number 2, Marvel and the Vietnam War. Kinda sounds insane, right? I mean, retconning a whole war? Well, in August of 2019, in History of the Marvel Universe issue 2, Marvel got super duper bold. So, before we dive into this, let's familiarize ourselves with the term sliding timescale. A sliding timescale is when a publisher adjusts the time frame of their continuity in order to keep their heroes, who rarely age, active for a certain amount of time. Imagine if Batman's timescale was accurate, he'd be almost like a century old. Another example of this is how Captain America was thought out around a decade ago rather than in 1963, which we did mention earlier on our list. So yeah, I mean, it could pose changes to his personality, but that's another list for another day. But some characters are rooted in a specific time period, like Frank Castle. He's a Vietnam vet. Not so easy to adjust that, right? Well, Marvel decided to invent a new war in order to adjust their timescales proportionately and not lose the thematic impact that those events previously had. So instead of the Vietnam War, there's a Sing-Kong conflict now. A bunch of characters who were present in the 60s now have an altered past in which they were involved in this war. Frank Castle, James Rhodes, Ben Grimm, Reed Richards were all involved in the Sian-Kong War. So that's a thing. Now, we've been moving chronologically on our list, but we felt that our number 1 spot had to go to a retcon that occurred within the same timeline as the rest, but has potentially altered things on a multiversal scale for this particular comic book publisher. We are talking about our number 1 spot, DC's Dr. Manhattan, and the fact that Flash did not create the New 52. And other stuff with Doomsday Clock. So we're returning to Doomsday Clock issue 9 here, but also the entire Doomsday Clock series, really. So, in issue 7 of that series, Dr. Manhattan, who is now a full-blown part of the mainstream DC universe because dear god they need to stop trying to milk Watchmen and just let it be, sorry, personal opinion there, we learn that there is an occurrence that has had a significant impact on the current DC continuity. Turns out, Manhattan has been meddling a lot in the DC universe. He prevented Alan Scott from becoming the first Green Lantern, therefore started a butterfly effect that also affected the Legion of Superheroes that we mentioned earlier. It's because of that retcon from a publishing standpoint, by the way. And Dr. Manhattan was the one who caused the New 52 to happen, not the Flash. Dr. Manhattan was the architect behind the Rebirth retcon as well. It goes so much deeper than that, but that's for a whole other video for another day. It's hefty, friends. Alright, there we have. And at number 10, Joe Chill who? One character that is critical to the Batman mythos but is constantly subjected to changes is Joe Chill, the petty criminal who killed Bruce Wayne's parents in that alleyway when he was a boy. For starters, Joe Chill being the one responsible was briefly retconned in the 90s with Zero Hour, and the truth was left hanging for years concerning whether or not Chill was really the one behind the Wayne's deaths. Then, in 2006 Infinite Crisis issue 6, he was confirmed to be their killer once again. But let's backtrack a little. This is where it gets annoying, frustrating, and a little scary, if messing with continuity or the thought of doing so is something that is frightful to you, which it should be, especially considering all of the mess that DC has created with Joe Chill. The way in which Batman discovers that Joe is his parents' killer has changed time and time again. It seems as if every several years we get a new take on Bruce's origin story, and him confronting Joe, or him rediscovering that Joe was the one who pulled the trigger, or him hunting him down and having some big moral dilemma about the whole darn thing. There have been multiple variations pertaining to Joe Chill's fate, various suspects, various storylines in which DC characters have believed to find new evidence, and then hunted down the real person responsible. Initially, we got a glimpse of this back in Detective Comics issue 33 in 1939. That was when we got Batman's origin story for the very first time. In 1948, in Batman issue 47, that man who murdered the Waynes was revealed to be a guy named Joe Chill. But then, the story changed again in 1956, then another time in 1968, then again in 1969, again in 1972, 1976, another time in 1982 where he was the Joker's hitman, and that whole storyline would then be shown in the 1989 Batman movie, then again in 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1989, 1998 in which Selina Kyle witnessed their murders, in 1999 in which the Wayne board was really behind it, 2001, 2003, 2006, 2008 in which Joe Chill commits suicide thanks to Batman's persuasion, 2012 in which the Penguin was suspected to be behind the hit, 2015 in which Batman encounters him through the powers he develops from the Mobius chair, and so many more adaptations that we didn't even cover. Most of the ones we did were in the comics, but there's a lot of stuff in the animated universe as well, and in other movies, and in Gotham. So if that didn't make sense as to why it's scary, here is another reason why it is pretty darn frightening. All of this retconning literally threatens to change Batman's mythos every single damn time that his origin story is redone. It's frightening. DC, please stop giving us new reasons and new scenarios in which we see Batman have to relive his previous trauma and choose whether or not to kill the man who killed his parents, who may have not actually been the man who killed his parents. Moving on to number 9, Jason Todd's hair. This one's a little less stressful than our last number. Back when Jason Todd was first introduced in the comics in 1983, it was as Dick Grayson's replacement, with the former Robin now heading the Teen Titans team. While it was a great thing that the new Teen Titans title was selling, DC felt that Batman may suffer from this, and introduced a brand new Robin that debuted in Batman issue 357. In his first few appearances, he was distinguished from Dick Grayson by having strawberry red hair, which was later changed because the character lacked popularity. So DC strove to make Jason Todd a little bit more like Dick. While that's technically a retcon in itself, perhaps what's even better is the fact that this change in hair color is something Todd would later on address after he was brought back from the dead. More on that later. Todd would admit that when he was Robin, Batman made him dye his hair to look more like Dick Grayson. While he never gives a full reason for Bruce making him do this, it's implied it's some sort of marketing ploy. But really, it just kind of feels like Batman fetishized Grayson, if we're being honest. And at number 8, Martha Kent has a miscarriage. Moving away from the Dark Knight and onto the Man of Steel now, we've got another take on retconned origin stories. In 1986, John Byron rewrote Superman's origin story in the limited series The Man of Steel. In this limited series, the Kents take Clark in as per usual, but Byron added an extra little detail. Prior to finding little Kal-El, Martha had a miscarriage. The Kents decided to exploit that miscarriage and pretend that Clark was actually their own. Guess that's one way of getting out of, neighbors asking questions. So why is this bothersome? It's the fact that the miscarriages became the motivation for why they adopted Clark rather than, out of the goodness of their hearts like in the initial origin story. It felt like an extra factor that was really unnecessary. An attempt to make the Kents more broody and justified in their need of, helping a baby that they found literally in the middle of nowhere. And at number 7, Jean Grey was never Phoenix. The Phoenix Saga, and Jean Grey by association, is perhaps one of the most iconic and recognized X-Men stories to date. And according to this retcon, it's also pretty meaningless. You all likely know the story. Jean is possessed by the Phoenix Force, a powerful cosmic entity that consumes her and ends up getting a bunch of people killed, including herself. By the end of this year, there will officially be 2 live-action movies that have followed that storyline. After Scott attempted to move on by shacking up with the literal clone of Jean Grey, Madeline Pryor, it was revealed that, surprise, Jean was actually alive. The Phoenix Force had apparently preserved her body in an underwater cocoon. But then, it turned out that she wasn't the Phoenix at all. And then Jean just kept dying and coming back and dying and coming back and who knows what's what anymore. So yeah, Jean's big sacrifice in killing herself in order to prevent the Dark Phoenix from destroying the entire universe is kind of pointless. Sorry guys. Some serious nihilism going on over at Marvel, I suppose. They just keep wanting to end the universe and then like, psych, it's not gonna end, but I guess, you know, that's comics. And at number 6, Damian Wayne. Back in 1987, DC released Batman Son of the Demon, in which he and Ra's al Ghul team up, and Bruce briefly considers becoming his heir. During that time though, Bruce has an affair with Ra's daughter Talia al Ghul, who ends up getting pregnant but then claims to have had a miscarriage. At the end of the story, it's revealed that she didn't have the miscarriage. And later on, Grant Morrison would introduce Damian Wayne, their son, the one who was conceived during Son of the Demon. Except, he changed some stuff. He was the product of Talia having drugged Bruce, forcibly sleeping with him in order to get pregnant as part of what she termed as a depraved eugenics experiment. So essentially she raped Batman, and Damian went from being the potential product of a heart-wrenching love affair to one that Batman had no choice in, since Damian's origins have been toyed with, including a retcon that suggested he was created thanks to cloning.
Number 5, Teresa Parker. Who is Teresa Parker? Honestly, after everything we've learned about her, that's a really great question, but one that isn't easy to answer. Initially, Teresa appeared in a non-canonical story, but ended up later being brought into the 616 continuity. There she was introduced as the possible mystery daughter of Mary and Richard Parker. Her birth being kept secret after the death of her potential parents, Teresa would be adopted and later would end up as a member of the CIA. As an adult, even she was unsure of her true parentage. It is implied, however, that she was the secret daughter of Mary and Richard, which would make her Peter's estranged sister. Eventually, her and Peter meet and even team up, but after we seemingly have somewhat confirmed her status as a Parker, although even that origin was still pretty shaky, it was later re-retconned that indeed she might not be. Chameleon attempted to manipulate Teresa, offering her alternative origins and even at one point suggesting that she may have come from the Chameleon Academy and be one of their own sleeper agents. Regardless though, Teresa addressed all the confusion of her origins by simply stating that regardless of her natural born parentage, she would always consider herself a Parker. So, hey, at least there's that. Does that make it any clearer? No. But at least we know where Teresa feels she stands. I think that's important.
Moving on to number 4, Barbara Gordon can walk. Again, back in 2011, DC introduced the New 52. The DC universe was essentially reset, with some bits of continuity remaining intact, funny enough. One of those bits of continuity that remained was Barbara Gordon's history with being paralyzed. This is something that occurred in The Killing Joke and saw the character trapped in a wheelchair, retiring from her days as Batgirl, only to rise up and reclaim her heroic identity once more by becoming Oracle. Barbara became an inspiration for physically handicapped readers everywhere. And she was still a total badass too, despite the serious trauma and continuous obstacles that her character continued to face and overcome. But then, the New 52 changed that. While the history was intact, so was Barbara's legs. Or I guess technically her spine. Despite having Gail Simone pen the Batgirl series, fans were outraged with the new Batgirl volume for taking Barbara out of her chair and putting her back into the Batgirl costume. Apparently she had received some really helpful and experimental physiotherapy that allowed her to walk again. Many felt that this was harmful to a positive kind of representation that Barbara stood for in the comics previously as Oracle. The one good thing though that the series did explore was the fact that Barbara was still very haunted by her past, and her struggles with her paralysis. It wasn't something that she was just cured of and never addressed again, thankfully. But still, I mean, she's pretty badass as Oracle. Up next at number 3, Legion of Superheroes. The Legion of Superheroes, which got a new series from DC in August of 2019, established a brand new continuity for the teenage group of heroes, setting them from the 31st century. Now they were introduced by traveling to present day and attempting to convince Superman's son, John Kent, to join their team, informing him that he's responsible for the formation of the United Planets in the 21st century. The Legion of Superheroes had received many a reboot in its time. Now, the first iteration debuted in Adventure Comics issue 247 in 1958 and would be retconned during Zero Hour in 1994 and again in 2004 and again in 2007. It's a lot of retconning. I mean, when you retcon a team that much, you kinda gotta question more about the team than, you know, maybe coming up with new stories for said team. Something's gotta give there. Next up at number 2, Watchmen. Watchmen has long been considered one of the most important graphic novels in the history of the medium. When it came out, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were praised by critics for transforming a medium that was often considered to be low art into something that was complex, thought-provoking, and subverted what we believed comics could do. It was a game changer, and it inspired many writers and artists that followed. Watchmen has long been considered a sacred text that does not get touched. Until DC decided that they could milk it for more money. As you can guess, Alan Moore was not fond of that. It first started with Before Watchmen, a group of limited series comics that acted as prequels leading up to the events of the main Watchmen graphic novel. Some of them were great. Darwin Cook, prior to passing away, rest in peace, did a fantastic job with the Minutemen series, expanding on the characters that Alan Moore had so finely crafted without making them into something that, felt out of line. Others weren't as well done, but their sales resulted in an unfortunate domino effect. DC brought the Watchmen into the prime continuity of their comics, making Dr. Manhattan a villain of sorts in the Doomsday Clock limited series, which acted as a direct sequel to Watchmen and tied in stories from the New 52 and Rebirth, because that's exactly what we all asked for, was a sequel to Watchmen. Nobody wanted that. No one. And if you're watching this and you actually wanted that, just go read it again, seriously. Re-educate yourself. That limited series Doomsday Clock is still ongoing now, and apparently by its conclusion the DC universe will be forever changed again. Kinda sounds like one massive retcon in the works again, doesn't it? Doesn't seem uncharacteristic of DC. The reason why it lands on our list is not the fact that it takes something that's so darn good and threatens to ruin it entirely, it's because Dr. Manhattan has been turned into a plot device to explain all of the retconning of the New 52. Dr. Manhattan is said to be the one responsible for rebooting the universe and creating the New 52 universe. Essentially it is a retcon that was put in place to explain another massive retcon that a lot of people didn't really like. It also made Ozymandias regret what he had done in Watchmen, and that just isn't right. That's stupid. You cannot dilute a character like that. That's not fair, guys. And finally, in at number 1, Jason Todd is brought back. Finally, we have the silliest, most wretched retcon of them all. Jason Todd was brought back from the dead, and Superboy Prime punched him back to life. Alright, let's really break down Jason's history here. For starters, in 1988, when Batman's comic sales were suffering thanks to the low popularity of the new Robin, Jason Todd, Dennis O'Neil of DC suggests that allowing the audience to have an interactive experience and vote on a plot point in the comics would not only be a great way to attract audiences, but also solve their little Robin problem. In a 4-part story arc called A Death in the Family, readers had the option to choose to call in and vote on whether or not Jason Todd would survive from an encounter with the Joker. Fans voted that he be killed off. It was a really close call with a 72 vote margin, and evidence came out afterwards that hundreds of votes for Jason's death came in from a single person who had programmed a computer to dial the voting number every 90 seconds for 8 hours. Jason was brutally beaten to death by the Joker, and for a long time, Jason was considered one of the only characters in comic books to never be resurrected. It's almost like a rule. One of the only ones to truly stay dead, along with Bucky Barnes and Uncle Ben. But yeah, look how it panned out for all 3 of them, eh? Anywho, Jason was brought back to life. At first, the idea of him being resurrected was teased as part of the 2003 Hush storyline, but later in 2005, Judd Winnick brought him back into the fray with the Under the Hood story arc, with Todd having a vendetta against Batman. And it just went downhill from there, guys. In at number 10, Zorn was Magneto all along. But he was also Zorn again. In 2001, Marvel brought in Grant Morrison to reinvent the X-Men, and amongst the many new aspects he introduced, he also introduced a highly controversial character named Zorn. Why was Zorn controversial? Well, initially he was a Chinese mutant who wore a skull mask that found his way out of prison and into Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, where he worked as a teacher. At the end of Morrison's run, he revealed that Zorn was in fact Magneto all along, who prior was presumed to have been dead. Zorn-Nito, as I will call him for the rest of this list, went on a massacre in New York and ended up getting into a full-on brawl with the X-Men and was killed off again, all as some beaten-to-death metaphor to symbolize the end of an era. After Morrison left, Marvel retconned the storyline, revealing that this Zorn-Nito was actually just a Magneto imposter himself, and that the real Magneto was alive and innocent. Eventually, they introduced a second Zorn, who was a twin to the original Zorn, and instead of having a star where his head should be, hence the mask, he had a black hole where his head should be. Look, they're different. And to make matters worse, there was no actual connection between Zorn and Magneto for any of this to be justified. It's noted in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, X-Men 2005, that this happened all thanks to Scarlet Witch meddling with reality prior to the House of M event. Confused? Yeah, most people still are when it comes to this retcon too. What did Magneto ever do to get dragged into this crap? In at number 9, Puck's Constant Pain. Puck is a character who was first introduced into Marvel Comics back in 1983's Alpha Flight issue 1. He's a 3'6" superhero named Eugene Judd, who initially, when created, had no superpowers at all. He was just exceptionally acrobatic and incredibly skilled at combat and was always armed with a good sense of humor. To make things more interesting though, the character suffered from constant pain thanks to a condition called achondroplasia, which often is correlated with dwarfism. But as time went on, Puck's origins were retconned, and when Bill Mantlo took over Alpha Flight, he decided to give a new meaning to Puck's aching. The retcon made it so that his small stature was due to a mystical influence. Puck once upon a time was 7 feet tall according to this retcon, an adventurer who stumbled upon something called the Black Blade of Baghdad, which contained the spirit of an evil sorcerer named Razar. Judd accidentally freed him, but trapped him using some sort of ancient mysticism, which basically put Razar inside of his own body, trapped for an eternity, causing him non-stop pain that eventually caused him to shrink down physically, but also made him immortal. So, he went from regular guy to someone walking around as a living prison for a mystical evil sorcerer. Yeah, that seems like it makes the most sense, doesn't it? And at number 8, Scarlet Witch's kids. I feel like the only sacred thing when it comes to Wanda Maximoff's family life is that she is a twin and that her brother is Quicksilver. Seriously, don't even get us started on the whole Magneto isn't actually her father debacle. So let's try to not make this confusing. Wanda, aka Scarlet Witch, once upon a time had twin sons named Wiccan and Speed. They became members of the Young Avengers. Vision was their father. Yes, he's a robot, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Wanda believed she had these two children with Vision until it was revealed that they were actually created by her reality warping abilities. Makes sense, cause you know, Vision is a robot. Anywho, it just gets worse from there. Wiccan and Speed are apparently made from 2 pieces of Mephisto's soul, who then tried to reabsorb those pieces, which then reincarnated Wiccan and Speed into Billy Kaplan and Thomas Shepard. The whole thing is just very, very confusing. Moral of the story? Hide your kids. And at number 7, 3 Jokers. Recently, DC came out with their Black Label imprint, comics aimed at more mature readers that are meant to exist outside of the main continuity for the most part. 3 Jokers is a 3-issue miniseries released under the Black Label imprint, except it was revealed by Jeff Johns that the 3 Jokers is part of the main continuity, which kinda confused some people. And this might be why. That imprint was inspired by a really ridiculous plot point that pretty much just disappeared entirely from the main continuity. So once upon a time in 2016, right at the end of the New 52, before Rebirth started up, Batman found himself in the Mobius chair, a plot device that basically gave him all of the knowledge in the world. Batman learns when he sat in this chair that there's actually 3 Jokers out there instead of 1. Then that revelation was dropped pretty much as soon as it was revealed, and hasn't been touched again since the mention of this Black Label 3 Jokers series. Oh boy. And at number 6, the Spider God. What's one way to piss fans off? Retcon an origin story that's over half a century old, and toss in a terrifyingly large and powerful spider into the mix while you're at it. Obviously, we are talking about Spider-Man here. In the controversial Spider-Man The Other story arc, it's revealed that Peter Parker was actually chosen by a spider god to become the web-slinging hero, which, yes, in case you're wondering, makes 0 sense. Thanks to J. Michael Straczynski, the spider god, a totemic god, quietly manipulated Peter's actions and went on to give him new powers as well, which allowed him to communicate with arthropods, have a poisonous bite, and, get this, wrist stingers. Best part was, this was never mentioned again, ever. Fans hated it, and it's also one of the reasons that our next retcon on our list was brought into the fray. And at number 5, Firestorm. Okay, finally getting into 2019 now. Doomsday Clock issue 9 decided to mess with an origin story too. We're talking DC's Firestorm's origin story. Also, spoilers for Doomsday Clock, we're talking about it a bit more on this list, so heads up. Issue 9 features Dr. Manhattan f***ing shit up, and that includes Firestorm shit. He ends up taking the character down memory lane 7 years prior. So the initial origin story for Firestorm is that student Ronnie Raymond and physics professor Dr. Martin Stein are merged together when the Hudson nuclear power plant explodes thanks to a terrorist attack. Now the retcon. Dr. Manhattan allows Ronnie to spy on Stein moments prior to the explosion, and it is revealed that the explosion wasn't actually a terrorist attack. It was an attack set up by Stein in order to fuse himself with Ronnie so that Stein could fully understand metahumans. I quote, "What better way to learn about these metahumans than from the inside?" That's some f***ed up stuff. And at number 4, Sentry. Sentry's story is a little terrifying. Sentry's story starts off with the alias of the character, a man named Robert, remembering that he was once a superhero. He realizes that no one else remembers him being an active superhero. And the deeper the narrative dives, the more we learn about this life that Robert, aka Sentry, had in the Marvel Universe. Turns out, Sentry has an evil other half living within him. That, with the scope of the powers that he has, was a supreme threat to the Marvel Universe. So Sentry, with the help of Reed Richards, ended up having everyone on Earth's memory of him erased, including his own. Essentially, his whole story was a massive retcon in order to introduce a character and squeeze him into previous storylines that had already existed in Marvel's history. It's one of the less painful retcons on this list, since it is doing something interesting with the narrative, but perhaps the scariest part of Sentry's entire story is how horrifying his other half, Void, truly is, and why he would go to those lengths to forever suppress him.
Number 3. Mr. Sinister's obsession. This has to be one of the weirdest retcons around. Although, I'm gonna be honest, I do kinda like this one. Mr. Sinister has always been known for being obsessed with the Summers family, especially Scott. This is seemingly because from a genetic standpoint, Scott Summers and his brothers have the most potential, with Sinister often believing that Scott's genes are actually the key to unlocking the most powerful mutant of all time. Typically, Sinister is a shipper of Scott and Jean together, and even went so far as to create a clone of Jean named Madeline Pryor to ship Scott with after Jean was believed to have died following the Dark Phoenix saga. I do not know where Mr. Sinister stands on the whole Emma Scott ship, however. In Sinister's own origin story as Nathaniel Essex, we later learn that this obsession with Jean and Scott together started before he was even Mr. Sinister really, with him meeting them when they traveled back to the past during a mission given to them by Clan Ascani. So basically, Sinister's obsession with Cyclops is kind of like a time paradox, because he met them as Nathaniel Essex before he met them as Mr. Sinister, but meeting them in their future, his past, made him obsessed with them in his future, their past.
And at number 2, Hydra Cap. Hydra Cap is the most recent retcon on this list. So in 2017, there was a series called Captain America Steve Rogers that set the foundation for some major reveals concerning Steve Rogers' origin story. We learned that he had been a sleeper agent all along for Hydra, and was basically a Nazi who stood against everything the character ever stood for. It was ludicrous. He ends up starting this whole war with him working with Hydra for global dominance, and it's later revealed that it wasn't actually Steve Rogers. Instead, the culprit behind this was an alternate timeline Hydra duplicate of Rogers. But considering the political climate that the series was released during, needless to say, making the epitome of American patriotism a fascist was a little on the nose there, Marvel. And finally, in at number 1, Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn got it on. This one is actually really terrible. It seems like poor Peter Parker gets the worst of the retcons, doesn't he? Or maybe they're just all penned by J. Michael Straczynski and that's why they all suck. Might be that. This retcon in the story arc since past added a lot of unnecessary details and motivation behind the events of the famous 1973 The Amazing Spider-Man, the night Gwen Stacy died storyline. After a pair of twins attack Spider-Man, Peter later finds out that they're actually Gwen Stacy's children, who are out to kill Peter for revenge. MJ would break the news to Peter, telling her that Stacy had confided in her. Stacy slept with Norman Osborn and gave birth to his twin children in France shortly before she died. The reason why Osborn went after her that night was because she was a threat to his potential heirs, because she wanted to raise his children with Peter instead. He was going after both Peter and Gwen that night. Still, the panels in which we see Osborn get freaky with Gwen are, well, not great. They kind of burn themselves into your retinas. Sorry, I am so sorry.